The rain had begun before dawn, a thin, stubborn drizzle that blurred the lamps along the quay and left the river swollen and brown. By the time Inspector Maigret reached the station, his coat was already damp at the shoulders and his pipe refused to stay lit. The telegram had arrived in the early hours, anonymous, unsigned, a single line of black type. "You will find the notebook in compartment 7. That was all. No name, no train listed, no explanation, only the faint echo of an unease that had already reached him before he'd opened the envelope. Now, standing beneath the soot-streaked vault of Gare Saint-Lazare, he watched the passengers drift past, a woman with a cage of doves, a soldier in faded uniform, a man carrying a briefcase clasped too tightly. Somewhere among them, Maigret thought, was the one who had left a trail of ink and silence. If you find yourself drawn into this fog-lit mystery, into the rain-soaked streets and the quiet rooms where truth moves slower than smoke, stay with us. There will be others who will find comfort in this kind of story. Share it, let it travel. Subscribe as one leaves a lamp burning in the night for whoever comes next. Because in Maigret's Paris, every clue begins with someone who cared enough to look closer. The morning had not yet gathered itself into light when Maigret awoke. For a moment he lay still, listening to the faint creak of the shutters and the sound of rain whispering against the panes. Paris was half asleep, the air thick with damp and the smell of soot. Somewhere in the distance, a bell struck 5. Then came the tapping at his door, polite but insistent, the kind of knock that carried both respect and urgency. Maigret rose, wrapped in his thick dressing gown, pipe in hand though unlit, and crossed the short distance to open it. A messenger boy stood there, pale and dripping, cap in hand, holding out a folded telegram that had already begun to curl from the moisture. He tore it open beneath the yellow lamp on his desk. The paper trembled slightly between his fingers as he read the single line typed in uneven letters. "You will find the notebook in compartment 7. Nothing more, no name, no date, no sender, no indication of which train or where. A sense of unease, faint but familiar, settled in his chest. Over the years he had grown accustomed to the eccentricities of the public, the anonymous tips, the cryptic notes sent to the prefecture. Yet this one felt different. There was something deliberate in its brevity, a confidence in the knowledge that he would understand or at least feel compelled to follow. By 6 o'clock he was dressed, the heavy wool of his overcoat still damp from last night's rain. Madame Maigret stirred as he left, her voice muffled from the pillow. "You'll catch cold again, Jules," she murmured, and he smiled faintly, closing the door softly behind him. Outside, the air smelled of wet stone and cold iron. The lamps along Boulevard, Richard Lenoir flickered like tired eyes. His breath came in slow clouds as he walked toward the cab stand, collar turned up, the pipe clenched between his teeth, though the tobacco remained unlit. Gare Saint-Lazare loomed like a cathedral to human restlessness. Steam hissed from beneath iron grates, mingling with the morning fog. The first trains of the day stood ready, their windows glowing faintly, passengers moving like ghosts between platforms. The inspector's boots echoed as he crossed the concourse, his eyes moving not on faces but on gestures. The hurried adjustment of a hat, the tightening of a glove, the furtive glance over a shoulder. Somewhere among them was the author of that telegram, or someone connected to it. And though Maigret had no reason yet to believe a crime had been committed, he felt the weight of something already begun. At the ticket counter, he asked quietly for information about the trains arriving during the night. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers, consulted his ledger. "The Le Havre Express arrived at 4:45, Inspector, otherwise only local trains." Maigret nodded. "Compartment 7?" he asked, and the clerk frowned, uncertain. "Of which carriage, monsieur?" "We'll find out," said Maigret, already turning away. 2 uniformed policemen met him on the platform. He gave them brief instructions to locate the train, to have the carriages inspected discreetly to disturb as little as possible. The station, even at this hour, was alive with the slow pulse of departure, the clang of metal, the murmur of porters, the hiss of steam. Somewhere a woman coughed, somewhere else a child cried, silenced quickly by a mother's gloved hand. When the Le Havre express was finally located, its compartments cold and empty now, the inspector climbed aboard. Compartment 7 was midway along the second carriage, its door slightly ajar. He paused before entering, noting the condensation on the glass, the smudge of a palm print, the faint scent of tobacco that did not match his own. Inside, the cushions were damp, the window half open to the drizzle. On the seat lay a folded newspaper from the previous evening, its headline about a minister's resignation, already blurred by moisture. He looked beneath the seat, behind the netting, under the coat hooks. Nothing. Only when he crouched to check the small space between the wall and the seat did his fingers touch leather. He drew it out carefully, a notebook, small, black, the kind that might be sold in any stationer's shop. Its cover was cracked, its pages swollen slightly from the damp. No initials, no emblem, only a faint indentation on the spine where a hand had pressed often. He opened it under the dull light that filtered through the window. The handwriting was neat, almost clerical, written in violet ink that had faded to grey. The first page bore a date from 2 days prior. Beneath it, a single name. A woman's name. He read it twice, before closing the book and sliding it into his coat pocket. "Was anyone seen leaving this compartment?" he asked, when the 2 officers returned. One shook his head. "No, Inspector. The porter remembers cleaning it before departure. Nothing unusual. No luggage left behind." The other hesitated, then added, "A passenger mentioned a man boarding at Rouen, tall, in a dark coat, carrying a briefcase, but she wasn't sure if he got off here or at Mantes." Maigret nodded slowly, eyes narrowing. "Find her again," he said, quietly. He stepped down from the carriage and stood on the wet platform, looking toward the glass ceiling where the rain pattered faintly. The station smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. Somewhere a bell rang for departure. It was a familiar scene, too familiar, and yet there was that peculiar feeling he always distrusted in himself. Curiosity edged with melancholy. It was the same feeling that had followed him through 100 cases, that sense of entering a story already half written, of being chosen rather than choosing. By the time he reached the Quai des Orfèvres, the fog had thickened, rolling in slow waves along the river. The office smelled faintly of cold pipe ash and old paper. Janvier was already there, sorting reports. "A new case, Chief?" he asked. Maigret handed him the telegram and the notebook. Perhaps, or perhaps only the memory of one. He struck a match and finally lit his pipe. The flame flickered, then steadied, filling the room with the sweet scent of tobacco. "Check the typewriter," he said. "Find out if any of the machines in our files match the ribbon impression on this telegram, and look into the name inside that book. Quietly." Janvier nodded and left. Alone again, Maigret turned to the window. The Seine lay below, dull and restless under the fog. Somewhere across the city, he thought, someone was watching the same river and waiting to see what he would do next. He drew on his pipe, exhaled slowly, and let the smoke curl upward into the silence. A case had begun, perhaps, but like all things that found their way to him, it had arrived not with a shout, but a whisper. Compartment 7 had the stale odour of old cloth and wet iron, as if the air itself were still carrying the sea salt breath of the line from Le Havre. Maigret stood for a long moment without moving, letting his eyes accustom themselves to the dimness. The window, left a finger's breadth ajar, admitted a thread of drizzle that had speckled the sill with pinpoints of water. He closed it gently and listened to the faint crack of the latch, the sound a man makes when he thinks he is alone. The cushions showed the shallow dents of 2 sitters, one deeper near the aisle, one slighter by the window. A hat would have hung from the left hook. A small arc of dust had been rubbed clean there. He imagined a hand lifting it down with care, the awkward brush of a sleeve against the panelling. He drew on his pipe. Without lighting it, tasting the ghost of tobacco on the stem, and felt the compartment begin to breathe its quiet story. He crouched again and ran a forefinger along the carpet seam where the wall met the floor. A grit of coal dust, the silvery sliver of a ticket stub torn along the perforation, and beside it something dried and brown-black, the size of a lentil, clung to the fibre. He touched it with the tip of his nail, and it came away hard and brittle. Blood, dried long enough to lose its colour, not old enough to be forgotten by the cloth. He wrapped the flake in a page he tore from his pocket notebook and slipped it into the inner lining of his coat. Then he leaned closer to the window latch. There, in the thin crescent where metal met wood, a faint smear remained, as if a finger had slid in haste. He took a handkerchief and pressed it lightly, folding the cloth over without looking at the stain. The newspaper on the seat, the evening edition, had bled its ink into a grey fog. The headline about the minister's resignation had fuzzed into an accusation without words. He lifted the paper and shook it. A few crumbs fell, biscuit perhaps, sweet. He frowned. The taste of a journey lies in its crumbs. A man who travels in fear seldom eats. Yet someone had eaten here, quickly, messily. He thought of 2 people sharing a paper, a hat, shifting, the smell of tobacco cut with the smell of rain. The notebook in his pocket weighed a little more than its size. Paper can be heavier than lead when it is waiting to be read. On the platform, Janvier appeared, with the porter in tow, a thin fellow whose cap had outlived his youth. "Monsieur l'Inspecteur," the porter said, rubbing his hands as if to warm them on words. "I remember this compartment. I cleaned it, yes, before departure. Very proper. 2 gentlemen boarded at Rouen, or, no, 1 at Rouen, 1 already inside?" "Forgive me, the morning was wet." Maigret did not hurry him. "What do you remember clearly?" The porter brightened, grateful for the lifeline. "A briefcase, black, smooth leather with a strap." He held it like a man holds a child, close. Tall, yes, and his coat was new enough to creak a little. And the other, if there was another, I saw only a sleeve, a darker cloth, older. When they arrived here, I did not see them get off. I was on the far side with the mail bags. "And women?" Maigret asked. The porter blinked as if the thought had not occurred to him. "There are always women, monsieur. 1 with a blue scarf asked me for the time, but she was not from this carriage. I think she was waiting for someone and then stopped waiting." Janvier's glance twitched toward Maigret, but the inspector's expression did not change. He filed the colour away. Blue. He did not know yet if it mattered. Colours sometimes served the memory in ways names refused to. They found the ticket inspector in a glass-fronted office smelling of ink and damp wool. He had the long face of a man who counts for a living and mistrusts words. "Compartment 7, second carriage," Maigret said, laying the telegram on the blotter without comment. The man studied the paper as if it might tell him something. "I checked tickets between Mantes and Argenteuil," he said. "A tall man, yes, Le Havre to Paris. Name?" They almost never look like their names. He kept his head down. The other seat was occupied at Rouen by a passenger who paid cash for the difference. Boarded late. I remember because he apologized in a low voice as he squeezed past me. He smelled of cigarettes, Gauloises perhaps, and a touch of bay rum. The train was hot, windows fogged. Did they speak? Not to me, to each other. They were the kind who do not converse, except with their own thoughts. Did anyone leave before the train reached the platform? The inspector shook his head as if dismissing a fly. To leap from a moving carriage in that rain. The fools who try such tricks are usually caught by their own bones, but between the platform and the exit, a man can change into a different man if he knows which corridor to take. Janvier gathered names of those who had passed through the compartment during cleaning, who had stood near the carriage doors, who had asked questions, who had avoided asking questions. A woman in a wool coat too fine for her gloves had insisted she saw a man alight while the train still rolled, hat clamped, briefcase tucked, slipping into the grey like a fish into silt. A soldier on leave swore the compartment had been empty after Mante and that the porter was inventing ghosts. Truth likes to hide in disagreements. It makes a nest of contradictions. By 10, the station had shed its morning hush for the rattle of midday departures. Maigret walked the length of the platform slowly, stopping to watch the way people stood when they were certain no one looked. The anxious shift from foot to foot, the stillness that comes with listening for a name one hopes not to hear. He found the woman with the fine coat again by a pillar, her breath smoking in small, even clouds. "Madame," he said, and showed his card. "You left the train at Saint-Lazare?" "I did," she replied, as if he had inquired whether she were standing where she stood. "You saw a man leave before the carriage stopped." Her eyes moved to the iron ribs of the roof, then back to his face. "I saw movement when there should not have been movement." "Is that the same thing?" "Describe him." "Tall, as your porter said, no beard, his hat grey felt, the brim turned down. He did not run, he dissolved." "Dissolved?" "Into a group of men who were waiting, or into the idea I had already formed of him?" "Inspector, do not ask me for more than that. I spent the journey trying not to exist." She gave a little laugh that made no shape in the air, and drew her coat closer. "You think me foolish?" "I think you saw what you could bear," Maigret said. She lowered her eyes in relief, as if he had placed a shawl on her shoulders. He sent Janvier to the telegraph desk to request passenger lists from Le Havre, Rouen, and Mantes, and to inquire discreetly at the prefecture about any ongoing matters in which a black briefcase might serve as a second spine. Then he returned to the compartment alone, closing the door behind him. The quiet there was the quiet of a church after a funeral, the air altered by absence. He took the black notebook from his pocket and opened it to the first page again. The violet ink had the careful slope of a clerk, a date 2 days old, a name beneath. He let his eyes rest on it without reading it aloud. Names, when spoken, become promises to the air. The handwriting bore a tremor on the downstrokes, a man unused to writing in trains, perhaps, or unwilling to let his certainty show. He leafed to the next page. Addresses, abbreviated, a rhythm of streets like a pulse. A circle around an initial, L, drawn with a pressure that had cut slightly into the paper. At the bottom of the page, an arithmetic no one would have noticed, 7 to 3, 311X. He closed the book and pressed his thumb against its spine. A man can load a small book with the gravity of his life when he knows he has not much time left to hold it. Lucas arrived in the early afternoon, his coat steaming from the rain, bringing with him an umbrella and his mild scepticism. "A compartment," he said, glancing around. "A notebook, a telegram without a sender. One could almost believe someone is writing a story for us to act in. It would not be the first time, Maigret replied. But stories generally hide their author less clumsily. He handed Lucas the handkerchief with the faint smear folded inside. Have the lab see what they can coax from this. And this, he added, passing the brittle flake ensconced in paper. If it is blood, we may learn whether it belongs to a man bothered by doctors. Lucas sniffed the air. Bay rum, he said, surprising himself. And something sweet. Biscuit, Maigret murmured. Which one of them ate, if there were two? Fear and hunger dance poorly together. They spoke with the station master, a man whose beard had thinned to the idea of a beard and whose memory kept schedules more faithfully than faces. There was a wire yesterday, he said, patting a drawer. From Dieppe to Rouen. A trunk delayed, not a person, but the sender's hand. He produced the slip, and Maigret held it beside the violet ink in the notebook. The handwriting was different, but the habit of forming the figure 7 with a small bar through the stem was the same. He filed that away too. Habits betray the body more readily than words betray the tongue. At noon, the rain eased to a fine dust. The lamps along the concourse seemed suddenly too yellow, as if the day, embarrassed, had arrived late. The woman with the blue scarf did not appear again, not that Maigret expected her to. He had seen the scarf only in the porter's recollection, and recollections are prone to embroideries. Perhaps the scarf was grey. Perhaps it was imagined. Or perhaps it would wind its way back into his path when the city decided to tangle her thread with his. They ate at a small cafe opposite the station, where the mirrors collected steam and the tables carried the marks of 1,000 cups set down in decision. Maigret did not remove his coat. He set the notebook on the oilcloth and let his fingers rest upon it, as if it might try to leave. Lucas spoke of a petty thief who had been picked up 2 nights earlier near Pont Cardinet, carrying a revolver with the serial number filed. He claimed he had found it, Lucas said, with the tolerable patience of a man who has heard this claim in all seasons. But the odd thing, he had a timetable folded in his pocket, the coastal line marked, Dieppe, Le Tréport, back to Rouen. Where is he now? In a cell, Lucas said, regretting the invention of the file. Let him regret by daylight, Maigret said. We will see him before the river forgets the afternoon. He paid for their coffee and stood, the chair's leg scraping a small complaint on the tile. Janvier was to inquire about the name, he added, almost to himself. The name on the first page had settled into his mind like a coin into a pocket corner. You might forget it until your hand brushed it again, then you could not forget it at all. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the office had the bluish light of a day that had not made up its mind. Janvier was waiting, a file under his arm. The name, he said, belongs to a woman who used it once at a boarding house on Rue des Petits Champs. Paid in advance, 3 nights, left before dawn. The concierge remembers the suitcase, heavy, and the way she asked for a room with a view of the street but closed the shutters at once. Did she wear a blue scarf? Lucas asked lightly, and Janvier looked puzzled. She wore gloves, he said, and spoke like someone who had learned Paris from newspapers. Maigret did not sit. We will visit the boarding house, he said. He slid the notebook into his pocket again, feeling its familiar resistance, as if it had learned the shape of him in the few hours they had been together. He glanced at the river through the window, the water's surface still roughened by rain and breeze, and thought, not for the first time that day, that he was following a line someone had drawn for him, a chalk mark along a pavement that the next shower would erase. They found the concierge knitting behind a desk that had known better hands, a pot of cabbage soup, breathing its honest smell into the corridor. "Yes, Inspector," she said, pleased to be the hinge upon which men with hats and serious faces turned. Room 3, first floor. She liked her privacy, paid with new banknotes. I always notice new banknotes. They make a sound. Old ones are quiet. She took meals out, sat very still when she sat at all. Did she receive visitors? One, the concierge said thoughtfully. A man who knocked without knocking, if you understand me. He came at dusk and left at once. He did not look at me because he wished to be the kind of man who had never seen a concierge. What did he carry? A briefcase, she said, with the satisfaction of a cat catching the scent of cream. Black, the kind with a clasp that clicks like a small tongue. Room 3 smelled of soap and rain. On the table, a ring of dryness showed where a lamp had stood. In the drawer, Lucas found a railway timetable, the coastal line inked with a pencil that had pressed too hard on Dieppe and less hard on everything that followed. Under the bed, Maigret's hand struck dust and the corner of paper folded into a triangle. He opened it carefully. The sketch of a corridor with a small cross marked beside a window. The kind of drawing a man makes for another man when words are risky. He stood at the window and looked down upon the street. A vendor was packing away his stall, the last oranges shining like little suns in the dimness. Somewhere, a clock struck 3. He slipped the triangle of paper into the notebook, closed both, and held them together as if to keep their whispered conversation from escaping. On the way out, the concierge asked, shyly, if the lady had done wrong. Everyone does wrong, Maigret said, not unkindly. It is the shape of the wrong that concerns us. She nodded, as if he had confirmed something about her tenants she had always suspected. In the corridor, Lucas touched the inspector's sleeve. "Do you believe we are being led?" he asked. "I believe someone wants to be found and is not yet certain whether he wants to be found by us," Maigret said. They stepped into the afternoon, the street glistening as if newly varnished. He drew his coat tight and felt the notebook's edge press into his ribs. There was an impression beside the bedside table where a revolver might have rested, and there were crumbs in a compartment where fear should have driven appetite away. He had the shape of a story in his hands, but the face of the unknown passenger remained always one turn of the corridor ahead. The river drew a slow breath as they crossed it, a dull coil under the arches. Somewhere upstream a barge horn moaned like an animal caught in a dream. He thought of the woman with the blue scarf, whether she existed as more than a porter's mourning, and of the briefcase that had moved from train to hand to room, with the quiet assurance of an object that knows it is being watched. Night would come early. It always did on days when the morning began with a telegram that was more suggestion than command. He would see the petty thief before vespers. He would send fresh wires. He would sit an hour with Madame Maigret and forget the name on the first page until it ambushed him again in the steam of his evening pipe. As they turned toward the quay, a wind slipped down the boulevard and scraped its damp fingers along the shutters. It carried with it the smell of distant salt and the iron taste of rails. The city seemed to lift its head, attentive. In a window above the cobbler's shop, a curtain shifted, pale as breath. Maigret paused, feeling that old, inexplicable certainty that somewhere very near, perhaps within a few steps, the unknown passenger had already passed and left behind him the slight change of temperature a body leaves when it moves through a room. He let the feeling settle as one lets the last ash fall from a pipe into the tray, and then walked on, steady as the river beneath the bridges. The thief was waiting in a cell that smelled of damp iron and sawdust. The room was lit by a single bulb, its filament trembling slightly in the draught from the corridor. He sat on the edge of his cot, hatless, hair pressed flat, staring at the scuffed toes of his boots as though they might tell him something he had forgotten. Maigret watched him for a moment before speaking, his broad frame filling the doorway. "You were carrying a revolver," he said quietly, "and a timetable." The man raised his head. His face was thin, hollowed by cheap wine and sleeplessness, but his eyes had the careful stillness of someone measuring distance before a jump. "I found the revolver," he said. "In the gutter near the freight yard. I was going to turn it in." Maigret smiled faintly, not unkindly. "You thought the police would reward your honesty. I thought they might overlook my debts." The man's mouth twitched in something like humor, but it did not last. "Tell me about the timetable. I like to know where trains go. You had the coastal line marked. Maybe I wanted the sea." "The sea doesn't take passengers without tickets," Maigret said, lighting his pipe. The first drawer filled the cell with a slow, sweet smoke. "Who gave you the timetable?" The man hesitated, rubbed his jaw. "A friend. Said he needed a favor. Carry something for him from Rouen to Paris. Said it was only papers, nothing dangerous." "What sort of papers?" "I didn't ask. He gave me a briefcase." Maigret let the silence grow until it filled the room like fog. "What did you do with it?" "I left it on the train," the man said finally, voice thin as the bulb's hum. "Compartment 7, the one they told you about, eh?" "Why?" The man's eyes shifted toward the wall. "Because when I opened it, it wasn't papers. It was a photograph, just one, a woman, and behind it, a letter with my name on it. I don't know how it got there. I thought if I left it, the trouble might stay behind too." "You thought wrong," Maigret said. He tamped his pipe and stood. "You'll tell Lucas everything you remember about the man who gave you the briefcase. Height, voice, shoes, the smell of his coat. Start with that." In the corridor outside, Maigret paused by the frosted window. Beyond it, the river glimmered under a thin film of moonlight. He could almost taste the salt that came drifting up from the west when the wind was right. It was the same wind that must have passed through Dieppe, through Rouen, through the station where the unknown passenger had stepped into his compartment with the black notebook and the briefcase that carried only absence. Back at his desk, the inspector spread out what remained of the evidence like a gambler laying down cards. The telegram, the notebook, the handkerchief with its smear now faintly brown, the page from the timetable, and the scrap of a corridor sketch found in the room on Rue des Petits Champs. Together they told nothing. Apart, they whispered too much. He turned the notebook to the second page. The handwriting wavered slightly, as if written on a moving surface. There was another name, initials only, and beside it the number of a bank account long since closed. He leaned back, watching the smoke curl toward the ceiling. Every case, he thought, begins with an object that doesn't belong where it is. A revolver in a thief's pocket, a notebook in an empty compartment, a name where no name should be. The city was full of such displacements, small and deliberate. The trick was knowing which one mattered before the river carried the rest away. Lucas entered without knocking, the faint smell of rain still on his coat. The lab says the smear on the latch is human blood. Type O, common enough. And the scrap from the carpet matches it. Nothing unusual, then, Maigret murmured. Except, Lucas continued, that the clerk whose handwriting matches the notebook, he's been missing for 2 years, officially presumed drowned near Le Havre. Presumed, Maigret repeated. By whom? By the same woman whose name appears on the first page. He said nothing for a long moment, staring at the wavering reflection of the lamp in the window pane. The city outside was a maze of glistening cobblestones, its secrets folded like damp letters waiting for someone to open them. Somewhere, perhaps at that very instant, the woman with the blue scarf was walking beneath those same lamps, her face lifted toward the rain, unaware that her name had just stepped out of a notebook and back into the world. "Janvier," he said at last, "get me the prefect. Tell him we're reopening the Le Havre drowning file." When the younger man had gone, Maigret reached for the notebook again. He traced the indentation where the hand had pressed hardest. The line trembled slightly, the way a man's hand trembles when he writes in fear or regret. He imagined the train rocking beneath that hand, the sound of wheels hammering distance into memory. He thought of the thief's description, the photograph, the letter bearing his name. Someone had built this story from fragments and left it for him to find, piece by piece, as though they wanted him to follow but feared he might arrive too soon. He closed the notebook and rose. Outside, the Quai des Orfèvres glistened in the lamplight, and the fog had thickened again, softening the edges of the world. He could hear the faint call of a barge horn downriver, the slow rhythm of oars dipping in the dark. Paris, restless, watching itself. He walked home through the mist, his pipe glowing faintly like a lantern. Madame Maigret had left the stew on the stove. The warmth of it greeted him as he entered. She asked no questions, only looked up from her knitting with that patient half-smile that said she understood far more than he ever told her. He ate slowly, the silence of the room deep and kind. Later, when she had gone to bed, he sat by the window overlooking the street. The lamplight pooled in the wet cobbles below. He opened the notebook once more, as one might open a wound, to see if it still bleeds. The ink had faded further in the damp air, but the name was still there, stubborn as guilt. He exhaled a thin line of smoke and watched it dissolve into the night. Somewhere beyond the fog, a train whistle blew, a long, mournful sound like a memory returning. He felt again that uneasy pull, the sense that the story was not moving forward but circling back to where it had begun. He thought of compartment 7, of the briefcase left behind, of the woman waiting on the platform with her blue scarf stirring in the wind. He rose, turned down the lamp, and let the darkness close around him. The case had begun to breathe. Dawn returned without sunlight, only a pale smear of grey that clung to the windows and made the rooftops look as though they had been dusted with ash. Maigret stood at the edge of the Seine, his collar turned up, the smoke from his pipe drifting unevenly in the wind that carried the smell of wet stone and oil. The river moved sluggishly, tugging at the reflections of bridges and lamps as if unwilling to let go. He had not slept, though Madame Maigret had insisted he should. The black notebook lay in his coat pocket, its presence faintly warming the fabric, like a fevered pulse he could not silence. The prefect had sent for him early. Inside the stone corridors of the Quai des Orfèvres, the warmth was deceptive, the kind that lingered in rooms too long sealed. The prefect stood behind his desk, a man built from caution and fatigue. "You are following the Le Havre matter again," he said without greeting. "It is closed." Maigret nodded, tamping down the tobacco with his thumb. "It was closed, yes, but the dead man is writing again." The prefect's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do not be poetic, Maigret. There are channels for such things. If this concerns missing clerks, lost notebooks or trains, leave it with the provincial office. They have need of practice." "It may concern more than that," Maigret said quietly. "A woman's name appears in his writing. She reported his death, and now she is again among the living. That seems worth the price of a train ticket." The prefect sighed, the sound of a man who had long since learned that disobedience dressed as logic could not be punished. "Be careful," he said, "meaning I cannot protect you if you step into something already claimed by others." Maigret nodded once and left. By the time he reached the street, the fog had thickened again. Paris seemed to float, its edges lost, its heart beating somewhere far beneath the stone. Janvier waited near the car, stamping his feet against the cold. "They sent the Le Havre file," he said. The clerk's name was Louis Delcourt, age 34, mild heart trouble. Worked for the Ministry of Finance until he vanished. His fiancée, one Madame Renaud, she's the woman who filed the report of his drowning. Address? Rue des Petits Champs, same boarding house we visited. She moved out 2 days after the report. Convenient timing, Maigret murmured. He got into the car, the seat creaking beneath his weight. The notebook, resting against his ribs, felt suddenly heavier. The drive through the city was slow, the streets choked with delivery carts and umbrellas. The cafes were just beginning to open, their awnings streaked with rain. At Rue des Petits Champs, the concierge greeted them with the wary curiosity of someone who has learned that every visitor in a dark coat brings either money or misfortune. "Madame Renaud?" Maigret asked. "She left no forwarding address," the concierge replied, but her eyes flickered toward the mailboxes at the end of the corridor. "She does return for letters sometimes, always in the morning before I open. She thinks I don't notice." Maigret handed her his card. "Next time she comes, you will notice." From there they drove to the café on Rue des Saussayes, where clerks often met to gossip. The owner, an old friend of Lucas's, poured coffee that tasted faintly of rust. "Louis Delcourt sat there," the man said, pointing to a table near the window, "always with papers. Said he liked to watch the trains go by, though we're half a mile from any tracks. He stopped coming a week before the papers said he drowned. His chair has been empty ever since, except for the occasional stray cat." "Did he ever meet anyone here?" "A woman, yes, older than him, elegant. Wore gloves even in July. She paid for both of them. When he stopped coming, she didn't. She just came once more, ordered 2 coffees, and left without drinking hers." They returned to the car in silence. The rain had begun again, steady and fine, like a conversation held behind a wall. Maigret watched the droplets gather on the windshield before sliding down. "Janvier," he said slowly, "imagine you are a man who has written something that should not be read. You leave a notebook where it will be found, and a telegram to make certain it is. But you are no longer alive. To see who opens it, who sends the telegram? Someone who wants it found," Janvier said, "or someone who wants it misunderstood." He opened the notebook once more, careful not to let the rain touch the paper. On the 3rd page, in smaller handwriting, were words written as though the writer had been interrupted. "The train changes at Rouen. She will have the briefcase by then. Tell no one until you are safe." There was no signature. They reached Le Havre by afternoon. The coastal wind came in gusts, carrying the cry of gulls and the distant echo of waves breaking against stone. The sea smelled of old iron and algae, a smell Maigret associated with endings. He had been there years before, investigating a dockworker's death, and the place had changed little. Grey water, whitewashed houses, the same cafe names painted over with new layers of fatigue. At the local station, a clerk produced the lost property ledger. "A briefcase was found 3 nights ago," he said, "brought in by a fisherman. Claimed it washed ashore near the docks." He led them to a cupboard lined with forgotten umbrellas and unclaimed parcels. The briefcase sat there, the leather dull but intact, its clasp showing a faint trace of salt. Maigret lifted it by the handle. It felt light, too light. He opened it. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, yellowed by sea air. It bore one sentence, typed in the same uneven print as the original telegram. "You are closer than you think, but farther than you know." Janvier exhaled sharply. "Someone's playing with us?" "Someone's arranging an ending," Maigret said softly. He looked out the window where the waves blurred against the horizon. The wind rattled the panes like fingers against glass. "Find me the fisherman who brought this in." They found him near the docks, mending nets with the patience of those who measure time by tides. "It floated in," he said, not looking up. "Tangled in rope. I thought it was empty, but when I opened it, there was that paper inside, dry as a sermon." "You didn't read it?" "I can't read," the man said simply. Back in their rented room above the port, Maigret stood at the window, smoking. The notebook lay open on the small desk beside the briefcase, the two objects staring at one another like adversaries. He thought of the telegram's warning, the circle around the letter L, the woman who waited at dawn for a man who may never have left the sea. It felt less like an investigation now and more like being led along a trail by someone who already knew where he would stop. Night pressed against the glass. Somewhere down the street, a piano played a waltz that no one danced to. Maigret drew on his pipe and thought of the line he had read. "You are closer than you think, but farther than you know." He wondered whether it was meant for him, or for the man whose name filled the first page of the notebook. The wind changed, carrying with it the scent of rain and the metallic whisper of trains. He knew, without knowing how, that the next step would not wait for him in Le Havre. It was already making its way back to Paris, back to the river that forgot nothing. He closed the notebook and pocketed it once more. Tomorrow, he thought, the tide would turn. The train back to Paris cut through a wall of fog so thick that the world outside the window seemed carved from smoke. Maigret sat alone in his compartment, coat unbuttoned, pipe unlit, his reflection in the glass merging with the blurred countryside beyond. The rhythm of the wheels was steady, hypnotic, an old tune he knew by heart. The briefcase sat on the seat beside him, the clasp still rusted with sea salt. Every now and then the inspector's gaze drifted toward it as though expecting it to move on its own. He had been followed by many objects in his life, guns, letters, portraits, but this one had a peculiar persistence, like a dream that refuses to dissolve after waking. Somewhere between Rouen and Mantes, the compartment door slid open. A woman stood there, her silhouette framed by the grey corridor light. She was tall, wrapped in a navy coat that smelled faintly of lavender. The blue scarf, though now faded, was unmistakable. She hesitated a moment before stepping inside. "I was told you'd be on this train," she said quietly. Maigret gestured to the opposite seat. "Then you've been told more than I have." She sat, hands clasped in her lap. Her gloves were worn at the fingertips. "You found the notebook," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And the briefcase?" He nodded. For a moment, neither spoke. The train rumbled through a tunnel, and their reflections flared and vanished in the window glass. When the light returned, she looked older, the kind of age that comes not from years but from silence carried too long. "It wasn't supposed to reach you," she said at last. "It did," Maigret replied. "And now you are here, so perhaps that was the intention all along." She met his eyes for the first time. There was defiance there, but beneath it, something else. Fear? Yes, but also sorrow that had worn itself smooth. "Louis trusted you," she said. "He admired you. He said you were the only one who might understand." "Understand what?" "That some truths don't belong to the living." The words lingered like perfume in the air between them. The inspector leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Louis Delcourt didn't drown, did he? She looked out the window, where the grey fields ran backward into mist. In a way he did. They needed him to vanish, and he agreed. But the man who left on that night train wasn't him anymore. He had already died in every way that mattered. Who are they? She smiled faintly, almost pitying. You still believe in they, as if power had a face. It doesn't. It has only signatures and instructions. Louis was clever, too clever. He discovered something in the ministry accounts, a channel of funds that didn't exist. He thought it was corruption. It was worse. Her voice lowered. When he tried to report it, he was offered a choice: disappear quietly or not at all. He chose to disappear. He sent me the notebook the night before he left, told me to give it to you if the sea didn't take him first. And the telegram? I didn't send it, she said quickly. Someone else did, someone who wanted the notebook found before I could destroy it. Maigret studied her carefully. She was trembling, but not from cold. And you came back to Paris? I thought I was safe. Then 2 nights ago I saw a man outside my building. He was smoking a pipe. I thought... She stopped. It wasn't you. The inspector said nothing. The train slowed, brakes squealing as it neared the outskirts of the city. The light in the compartment flickered, yellow and tired. You'll come with me, Maigret said at last. You're not safe alone. I'm not safe anywhere, she murmured. But she didn't argue. At Gare Saint-Lazare, the city received them with the same drizzle that had started this entire affair. The lamps burned pale circles in the fog, and the air smelled of coal, coffee, and human haste. Janvier waited by the barrier, his hat pulled low. Inspector, he said, the prefect sent word. You're to report immediately. Maigret nodded, then turned to the woman. You'll wait at my office, he said. Lucas will see that you're comfortable. She hesitated. If I wait, she said softly, you might never return. He gave her a look that was both weary and kind. Then you'll have my chair and my pipe. That's almost the same thing. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the prefect's office was dim, the air heavy with cigarette smoke and unspoken tension. The man behind the desk didn't rise as Maigret entered. You've involved yourself in matters that do not concern the police, he said flatly. They concern a man's death. They concern a file stamped classified. You are to leave it alone. The woman, what's her name? Renaud. She'll be placed under protective custody. You'll hand over the notebook and the briefcase. Maigret took the pipe from his mouth, tapped the bowl gently against his palm. No, the prefect blinked. No, not yet. This isn't a request, Maigret. I know. He turned, walked out before the man could reply. The echo of his boots followed him down the corridor. Outside, the fog was lifting slightly, revealing the curve of the river like a vein under pale skin. In his office, the woman sat near the stove, hands folded, watching the smoke curl upward. Lucas stood by the window, arms crossed. Orders? He asked quietly. None that matter, Maigret said. He took the notebook from his pocket and placed it on the desk. The woman's eyes followed it. Louis wanted this to end here, she said. He believed truth was something you could bury deep enough to make it harmless. Truth, Maigret said, lighting his pipe, has a way of walking home on its own. He opened the notebook to the final page. There was a small envelope glued there, so thin it might have been overlooked. He peeled it loose carefully. Inside was a scrap of paper bearing a single line written in that same careful violet ink. When the river runs backwards, you will know the truth. Lucas frowned. A code? Perhaps, Maigret said, or perhaps only poetry. He rose, went to the window. The Seine silver and still, seemed to hold its breath beneath the bridges. For a brief moment, in the reflection of the opposite bank, the current seemed to shift the wrong way, curling upriver before smoothing again. He wondered if the mind, like water, sometimes turned upon itself. Behind him, the woman spoke. "Inspector," she said softly, "if they come for me—" "They won't," he interrupted. "Not tonight." But even as he said it, he knew the city was already moving, cars whispering through fog, footsteps echoing on wet stone, the unseen rhythm of those who tidied away the past. He turned down the lamp, the room falling into half-shadow. "Tomorrow," he said, "we begin again, from the river." The briefcase clicked shut like a punctuation mark. The fog thinned overnight, replaced by a bitter wind that swept through the boulevards like a broom, clearing secrets from the city's corners. When Maigret stepped outside his apartment, the cobblestones gleamed under a weak sun, and for the first time in days, the air smelled of something clean. Soap, perhaps, or new bread, rising somewhere behind closed shutters. It was deceptive, that cleanliness. Paris often wore honesty for an hour in the morning, before covering it again with lies by noon. He lit his pipe, the match flaring briefly in the wind, and started toward the river. The Seine was restless that day, its surface flickering in opposite directions, as if uncertain which way to flow. The phrase from the notebook's last page repeated itself in his mind: "When the river runs backwards, you will know the truth." He had read it too many times to treat it as poetry anymore. Perhaps it meant a reversal, someone coming back from where they should have been lost. Or perhaps it was literal. He had seen stranger things than rivers changing course. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas and Janvier were waiting with the expressions of men who had slept poorly. "They took her," Lucas said without preamble. Maigret paused at the threshold. "Who?" "The woman." "Madame Renaud." Two men came near dawn, showed prefecture papers, claimed it was an internal transfer for her protection. I checked. No such order was filed. "Where did they take her?" "No one saw. They left in a black Citroën, no plates." Maigret's pipe went out. He didn't relight it. "And the prefect?" "Not in his office," Janvier said. "They say he's ill." The inspector walked to his desk slowly, as though distance might dilute the inevitability of things. The black notebook lay open where he'd left it, but the briefcase was gone. Someone had been thorough. He closed the notebook gently and placed a hand on its cover, feeling the faint indentation of the violet ink beneath. "They're tidying up," he said, "and we are meant to watch." Janvier shifted uneasily. "What do we do?" "We follow the river," Maigret said. By midday they were at Pont-Neuf. The city moved around them, ordinary and unconcerned, carts loaded with oranges, schoolchildren in caps, a man selling newspapers whose headlines spoke of strikes and scandals unrelated to death or disappearance. Maigret leaned against the stone balustrade, watching the eddies below. "Do you see it?" he murmured. "The current?" Lucas asked. "It's divided," Maigret said. "Two flows, one east, one west. The river's confused." Lucas frowned. "You think it means something?" "I think Louis Delcourt believed in signs," Maigret said. "He wrote like a man who expected the world to explain itself in metaphors. Maybe this was his way of saying that when opposites met, when cause and effect blurred, the truth would show itself." They walked along the quay to a café overlooking the water. Inside, the stove crackled and the windows were clouded by steam. The waiter recognized Maigret and served him without asking. Coffee, black, a small glass of brandy beside it. "There's a wire for you," the man said, handing over an envelope. It had been delivered an hour earlier. Maigret opened it carefully. The message was brief, typed in the same uneven hand as the earlier telegrams. Return to where the sea begins. No signature. He folded it, slid it into his coat. They're pulling us back, he said quietly. To Le Havre? Lucas asked. To the beginning, Maigret replied. The notebook was meant to bring us there, not here. By evening they were once again on the train, the same route, the same compartments. The motion of the carriage felt like déjà vu. Rain began near Rouen, streaking the glass. In the reflection, Maigret could see his own face and, faintly beside it, Louis Delcourt's, an image he had constructed from the photograph the thief had described. Tired eyes, narrow shoulders, the look of a man who had walked out of his own life. They arrived after midnight. The port was asleep except for the gulls circling the lamps. Somewhere, a ship's horn called out over the water, a long, mournful sound that seemed to come from under the sea. They checked into a boarding house near the docks, the kind of place where every step on the stair announced its age. The owner handed Maigret a key and a look that said he'd already been asked not to talk. At dawn, he found the fisherman, again the one who'd recovered the briefcase. The man was mending nets in the same spot, his hands moving slow and steady. You were right, Inspector, he said, before Maigret could speak. The tide brought something else last night. He reached behind the bench and held up a small oilskin pouch, dark with seawater. Maigret opened it carefully. Inside was another notebook, smaller, the same black leather, though its spine was swollen from salt. The writing inside was faint, but legible. If you are reading this, then I have failed to stay dead. Forgive me, but there are worse things than drowning. The signature was Louis Delcourt's. Maigret stood silent, listening to the gulls. He survived, Lucas whispered. Perhaps, Maigret said. Or perhaps he wanted us to believe he did. The living sometimes hide behind the dead more easily than the dead hide behind the living. They followed the fisherman's directions to a small warehouse near the end of the quay. The doors hung open, swaying in the wind. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of tar and ropes. In the far corner, beside a stack of crates, stood the briefcase they had lost in Paris. Its clasp was open. On the floor beside it lay a woman's glove, blue silk, turned grey by damp. Maigret approached slowly. The glove was recent, the silk still soft, the lining faintly perfumed. He felt something twist inside his chest, that old ache that came when the story he'd been following began to close its circle. He turned the briefcase over and found a folded sheet of paper taped beneath it. Do not look for me again. The river has already chosen its direction. The handwriting was hers. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the first drops of rain. The sea darkened, its surface rolling with the slow determination of something that had seen too much. Maigret stood there for a long while, pipe unlit, watching the horizon dissolve. Janvier broke the silence. So it ends here? Maigret shook his head. Nothing ends at the sea, it only begins again somewhere upstream. He walked back toward the town, his coat whipping in the wind. The tide was rising fast, tugging at the mooring lines, pushing the water against the stone walls until it foamed and hissed. For a moment he thought he saw something move beneath the surface, a reflection or a memory, something like a figure walking calmly into the depths, leaving only ripples behind. That night, back in his room, he opened both notebooks side by side. The handwriting matched perfectly, even in its tremor. Between the pages of the second book was a photograph, a man and a woman standing by the river, smiling slightly, as if sharing a secret only the water could understand. On the back Written in that same violet ink were 4 words: "We chose the current." He stared at it until the lamplight blurred. Outside, the rain hammered softly on the window panes, steady as a heartbeat. He reached for his pipe, but his hands did not move to light it. The truth had arrived, quiet and unspectacular, like a tide returning to shore. By morning, the fog had settled again over Le Havre. The river would continue to run the right way, and no one would ever speak of Louis Delcourt or Madame Renaud again. Yet, in Maigret's dreams, the Seine sometimes turned and flowed backward, carrying with it a small black notebook that refused to sink. Morning crept in like a tired guest who had lost the address. A pale, uneven light bled through the thin curtains of Maigret's room, and for a moment he did not know whether it was Le Havre or Paris outside. The pipe on the bedside table had gone cold. The notebooks lay open, their pages curled and freckled with salt. He sat up slowly, joints protesting, the weight of the previous night still hanging from his shoulders like a wet coat. The rain had stopped, but the air held that peculiar stillness that comes after the sea has decided it has said enough. He poured the last of the tepid coffee from the enamel jug and stared at the surface, dark and uninviting. The photograph on the table caught his eye again, the man and the woman by the riverbank, the faint smile, the blurred motion of the water behind them. He had seen too many such photographs, the kind that pretended to capture happiness, but in truth caught only the moment before the fall. On the back, we chose the current. There were no more notes, no more cryptic instructions. It was not a clue, it was a decision. He dressed, pulling on his heavy overcoat as if to armor himself against thought. Outside, the docks were waking, men shouting, gulls shrieking, ropes being pulled through wet hands. The sky was the color of pewter. He walked without hurry toward the pier where the fishermen had found the notebooks. The water slapped against the stone like slow applause. A patrolman recognized him and saluted. "Inspector?" The gendarmes dredged near the western inlet at dawn, the young man said. They found a car submerged just off the slipway. Citroën, black, 2 bodies inside, a man and a woman, papers washed away. Maigret didn't ask for more, he didn't need to. The picture was complete, and it had ended where all rivers end. He nodded once, the gesture of a man acknowledging something inevitable. "Tell them to treat it with care," he said. "They deserve that at least." He stood there long after the patrolman had gone, the smoke from his pipe carried away by the sea breeze. There was no satisfaction in it, only the hollow quiet that followed when the questions had stopped fighting. The briefcase, the telegrams, the false drowning, the second notebook, it had all been a slow confession, written across cities and tides. They had not tried to hide from justice, they had tried to find a version of it they could live with. By noon, he was on the train back to Paris, seated once more in a compartment that smelled faintly of coal and damp leather. The countryside slid past, flat and grey. He watched it as if it were explaining something in a language he no longer spoke. When the whistle blew at Rouen, he thought of Louis Delcourt writing in violet ink, choosing every word carefully, and of Madame Renaud folding the glove she left behind in the warehouse, knowing that he would find it. They had planned everything, the trail, the telegrams, even the illusion of being hunted. Perhaps it was their way of taking control of the story before someone else wrote its ending. In Paris, the air was sharper, cleaner, as if the rain had scoured away a layer of deceit. The Quai des Orfèvres looked unchanged, but Maigret felt the subtle difference one feels when returning to a house after a funeral. The rooms identical, yet lighter, emptier. Lucas was waiting with a fresh report in hand. Nothing from the prefect, he said. They've buried the file. Officially, it's an accident. Good, Maigret said simply. He hung his coat on the peg and walked to the window. The river was visible between the buildings, moving steadily east. Anything from the press? Nothing yet. They'll invent something by evening, Maigret murmured. They always do. He sat at his desk and opened the first black notebook again. The ink had dried to the colour of old violets. Every page now felt less like evidence and more like a diary of resignation. Between the lines he could sense the tremor of hands that had written not for discovery, but for closure. The inspector's thumb rested on the page where the sentence still waited. When the river runs backwards, you will know the truth. He closed it gently. The river never runs backwards, he said aloud. It only remembers. Janvier appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. Chief, the others are going for lunch. Shall I bring you something? Nothing, thank you, Maigret said. I'll eat at home. He left a few minutes later, walking through the chill air of the afternoon. The cafes were beginning to fill, the smell of coffee and Gaulois drifting through the narrow streets. At the corner of Rue de la Cité, he stopped to buy a small bunch of violets from an old woman. They were wilted at the edges, but still fragrant. He didn't know why he bought them, perhaps because Louis would have liked the gesture, or perhaps because the ink in the notebooks had been the same shade. At home, Madame Maigret greeted him with her quiet warmth, ladle in hand, the smell of stew thick in the air. "Another case finished?" she asked. "As much as they ever are," he said, placing the flowers in a glass of water. They ate in companionable silence. The rhythm of her movements, the way she poured the wine, folded the napkins, was grounding, steady, the opposite of the drifting he'd felt in Le Havre. When the meal was done, he leaned back, pipe in hand, eyes half closed. "Strange thing about rivers," he said after a while. "You can watch them for years and you think you know them, but every time you look, the water's different." Madame Maigret smiled faintly. "That's what makes them rivers, isn't it?" He nodded. "Yes, that's what makes them rivers." Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the faint smell of rain and coal smoke. Somewhere down by the Seine, a barge horn moaned in the distance, a low, steady sound, neither mourning nor celebration, only continuation. Maigret closed his eyes and listened, the violet flowers breathing softly in the glass beside him, the black notebook locked away in the drawer where unfinished stories belonged. And far below, unseen in the night, the river kept moving forward, never backward, but never forgetting. The story had closed its circle, but Paris never really closed anything. By the next morning, the fog had burned away, leaving the air brittle and bright, the kind of deceptive sunlight that made even the oldest facades look newly painted. Maigret walked to the Quai des Orfèvres early, his hat pulled low, his pipe unlit. The street still glistened from the night's drizzle, and in the café windows the reflections of passers-by folded briefly into one another before disappearing again, faces half-seen, stories half-lived. He crossed the Pont Saint-Michel and paused at the midpoint, leaning over the parapet. The Seine was moving with its usual patience, brown and imperturbable, carrying barges loaded with stone and coal and everything else the city needed to keep its heart beating. It had not reversed course, it had never meant to. But Maigret thought, as he often did, that the river understood more about men than men understood about themselves. It took everything and judged nothing. Inside the quay, the familiar smell greeted him, tobacco, wet wool, and the faint tang of ink and carbon paper. The corridors were busy again, reports were being typed, phones were ringing, and the small dramas of 100 other lives had resumed
without pause. Janvier handed him the morning newspaper, folded neatly. There was nothing about Le Havre, nothing about drowned lovers or missing clerks, just politics, strikes, a minister's speech, a photograph of a film star the world had already decided to forget. He carried the paper into his office and set it aside. The black notebook still lay in his drawer. For a long time he didn't open it. When he finally did, the ink seemed paler, the lines more fragile than he remembered. He turned the pages slowly, half expecting the words to have rearranged themselves overnight. But they hadn't. They stayed where Louis Delcourt had left them, quiet, deliberate, resigned. Maigret traced the groove of a letter with his thumb. The handwriting trembled less now that he knew its story. Fear looks different when you've met its end. Lucas arrived with coffee, 2 cups balanced on a small tray. "You're early," he said, "and sober enough to frighten the janitor." Maigret smiled faintly.
I wanted to see the river. Still flowing the right way? As far as it knows, Maigret said. They drank their coffee in silence. The city beyond the window was already awake, traffic rising in a steady hum, bells tolling somewhere across the river. Lucas placed his cup down and said, Do you ever get tired, Chief?" Maigret looked at him, surprised by the simplicity of the question. "Of what?" "Of carrying other people's endings." The inspector leaned back, pipe stem turning idly between his fingers. "It's not the endings that tire me," he said after a while. "It's the beginnings that look too much like endings. You chase them thinking you can tell the difference, and then you find out you can't." Lucas nodded, understanding enough not to ask more. He left, and Maigret was alone again with the notebook and the slow rhythm of the clock. He spent the rest of the morning writing his report, brief, factual, deliberately incomplete. Subject, unidentified incident involving recovered documents and deceased persons. Case closed pending further instruction. He signed it, dated it, and placed it in the out tray. It would disappear into the archives, filed neatly under some heading that would mean nothing to whoever opened it in 50 years. And that was as it should be. At midday he walked to the little restaurant near Place Dauphine, where he sometimes lunched alone. The waiter, who had known him for years, nodded and brought the usual: beef stew, bread, a carafe of red wine. Outside, the trees were shedding their last leaves, the wind carrying them in brief spirals before dropping them into the gutters. He ate, slowly, savouring the warmth of the food, the ordinariness of the moment. When he finished, he stepped out into the light. The air was colder now, the sky a hard blue streaked with thin clouds. On impulse, he turned toward the bookshop on the corner and bought a new notebook, plain, unmarked, its cover black like the other. He slipped it into his coat pocket. Perhaps he would use it for nothing. Perhaps he would use it to remember. That evening back home, Madame Maigret was darning a sock by the stove. The small domestic sounds, the click of her needle, the simmer of the pot were as reassuring as the heartbeat of a familiar room. "You're quiet," she said, without looking up. "Just thinking." "About work?" He smiled. "About the river." She glanced at him over her glasses, amused. "The river again. Did it tell you its secrets this time?" "Only that it keeps them better than we do," he said. She shook her head fondly and went back to her stitching. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, hesitant, uncertain, melting before they reached the ground. Maigret drew on his pipe and watched them vanish against the window pane. He thought of Louis and Madame Renaud, of the notebooks, of the tide rolling in and out, erasing footprints, but never the memory of them. He rose, fetched the new notebook from his coat, and placed it on the shelf beside the others. Its pages were empty, waiting. He didn't know what he would write in it, or if he ever would. But he liked the thought that something new could still begin, even after everything had ended. When the clock struck 10, he turned down the lamp. The apartment sank into gentle darkness. From the river, faint and far away, came the low hum of a barge horn, as steady as breath. Maigret listened until it faded, then whispered to no one. Always forward. And somewhere beyond the rooftops the Seine flowed on, patient, eternal, carrying every story that had ever tried to stop within it. The house stood 2 streets above the harbour, a narrow building with shutters closed against the wind, and a door that remembered too many hands. Maigret climbed the steps slowly, feeling the sea's breath push at his back, carrying the smell of rope and tar and the faint sourness of algae. The note that had brought him there was brief, an address, a time, nothing more, and had been slipped under his door at the boarding house while he was out walking the quay. He did not wonder how they always found him. Paris had taught him long ago that the world had more corridors than it had rooms. He touched the notebook in his pocket as one might touch a relic before entering a church, and knocked. The door opened a fraction, then wider. She stood there with the scarf loose around her throat, the blue of it dulled by salt and years. Her eyes, in that first instant, seemed to expect him, and not expect him all at once, as though every possibility had been rehearsed and found wanting. "Inspector," she said softly. "You came alone?" "Alone," he said, as asked. She stepped back to let him in and closed the door against the wind. The room was deeper than it looked from outside, its walls the colour of bread left too long in the oven. A single candle burned on the table, its flame steady, a small insistence against the damp. The shutters were latched. Between them a line of light escaped and fell across the floor like a blade. The air tasted of smoke and soap and something else, lavender perhaps, or perfume, stored away so carefully that it had learned silence. She gestured to a chair. He did not sit, neither did she. For a moment they regarded one another with the polite wariness of strangers at a wake. "Thank you for the train," she said at last. "It spared me a night with men who carry orders in their coat linings." "You were taken," he said. "From my office." She smiled without humour. It is a skill to be taken. One must learn to look compliant at the right moment. They wanted the notebooks. They already had a copy of one. There are always copies. But they needed to know which version you had. "And which version do you have?" he asked. "The one Louis wrote for you," she said. The one he wrote when he had already decided to leave the
living. The candle hissed once, as if a drop of wax had found a seam. She drew her scarf tighter, then let it fall again, the gesture of a woman who had grown tired of hiding in fabric. "He believed in you," she said, "more than he believed in anyone." It made him reckless. "Belief makes some men steady," Maigret said. "It makes others jump." She moved to the window and put her palm against the wood, as if feeling for the temperature of the harbour. "He worked late," she began, not looking at him. "Always late. Numbers were a kind of music for him. He said if you listened long enough, figures would sing what men tried to keep quiet. At first it was ordinary, petty abuses, relatives paid to do nothing, the kind of corruption that is simply another word for appetite. But then the numbers changed. Money went out and came back under a different name. Loans that were not loans. Charities that were not charitable. It reached beyond men who fear prison. It touched men who fear embarrassment. And he wrote it down. Because it was the only way he could keep his head from splitting, she said. He told me once that the hand knows how to carry weight, the mind cannot. The night he left, he copied the names twice, once for himself and once for a man he had met only in newspapers. He sealed the envelope to you and then opened it again and added, in the smallest script, "Forgive me if I do not trust you soon enough." Soon enough for what? For our vanishing, she said. It was already arranged. The sea obeys the right men, Inspector. They had a boat and a story prepared. A drowning is simple. It asks little of the living. We were to go at dusk when the tide was without personality, and the gulls were loud enough to turn a shout into weather. She turned at last to face him. Tears had not yet come. They hovered like fog at the border between sea and land. He went without his hat. I told him it would be noticed, and he said that was the point. Someone must notice the wrongness for the rightness to be believed. He carried the briefcase like a man who has agreed to be theatrical. The photograph inside, yes, that was for you. Not to identify us, but to identify that we had once been kind. He thought kindness would protect us even when names would not. It seldom does, Maigret said. I know, she said, but we chose to behave as though it might. And sometimes that is the only choice the world allows. She came to the table and touched the edge of the candle holder lightly, not to steady herself, but to steady the light. We were meant to go out together, she continued. But halfway down the stairs he turned. He said there was one more thing to do. He took the notebook I thought he had left for you and wrote a line on the last page. I didn't see it then. I saw it later, when the house was already an echo. When the river runs backwards, Maigret said. She looked at him
sharply, surprised that the words could travel that far and still be themselves. Yes, she said. That. He wasn't a poet, you understand? He liked sentences that held their shape. But sometimes a man reaches for music when facts begin to rot. The wind pried at the shutter, found no entry, sulked away. Outside, the harbour made its small noises, rope rasping wood, water kissing stone. She took a breath that broke, then began again. We were met at the quay by a man whose face had been made forgettable on purpose. He had the authority of someone who never raises his voice. He told us the tide would be on our side. We walked. The boats were shadows trying not to notice one another. And then she stopped, frowning, as if a thread had snapped between memory and telling. And then he was gone. Louis? She nodded. Not gone like a magician, gone like a good clerk, abruptly, with paperwork already in place. He had turned into a doorway when I was looking at the line of the water, and when I turned back, the doorway had nothing to recommend it. The man with the forgettable face was still beside me. He did not seem surprised. He said softly, "He'll have his reasons." It was not a question. "And you?" "I waited," she said simply, "because sometimes waiting is an answer." She glanced down at her hands and discovered they were trembling. She pressed them together until the tremor became a single stillness. He sent the second notebook after that. It arrived wrapped in oilskin, as if it had sailed on its own to find me. He told me what you already suspect, that the first drowning was a rehearsal for the second, that he would write as long as he could because writing was a kind of breathing, that if I loved him, I must learn to love also the part of him that no longer trusted daylight. She moved closer to Maigret, as if proximity could edit the past. "You think you are listening to a confession," she said. "You are not. Confession is for priests and husbands. I am giving you a map that only a tired man can read." "What does the map show?" "A choice," she said. "Two kinds of justice. The one that ends in a cell and the one that ends in the sea. He wanted the sea, not because he was a coward, because he was proud. He would not stand under lights and be asked his name by boys with ink on their cuffs. He would not have his numbers questioned by men who had forgotten how to add. He chose the current. And you? She smiled tightly, then shook her head, more at herself than at him. I chose him, she said, which means I chose whatever he chose while pretending I had not. She reached into her coat and brought out a small envelope already softened by damp. He told me to give you this when I could, if I could, not sooner. She placed it on the table between them and withdrew her hand as if from a flame. Do not open it here, she said. Not while I am still a woman and not yet a memory. He looked at the envelope, but did not touch it. What happens now? He asked. Now? She tilted her head as if listening to the sound of the harbour argue with the wind. Now I go back to him. Back to the sea? To the place where the river chooses its direction, she said. It is an old argument, Inspector, older than your office and my scarf. Men try to steer water with money and orders. Water does as it pleases. We tried to please it. Let me help you, he said, and knew as he spoke that the words arrived too late, like a telegram misrouted by a tired clerk. You already have, she said gently. You listened without promising me the kind of safety that must be paid for later. She reached up, retied the scarf with a small, neat gesture, and then untied it again, letting it hang. You will not look for us after tonight, she added. You will think of us only when you need to remember how numbers become music. He took a breath, tasting candle and salt. And if I choose the other justice? She met his eyes, and for a heartbeat, her defiance lifted, and something like gratitude took its place. Then you will be the man Louis believed you were, she said, because that man knows when to close a notebook. They stood without movement while the candle shortened itself by a finger's breadth. Her face in that light had the calm of someone who has signed the final page and refused to look for errors. At last, she took her gloves from her pocket and drew them on with care, smoothing each finger as if to ensure that the past would not snag on the present as she passed through it. She opened the door. The wind leaned in like a dog that wants attention and then, rebuffed, retreated down the steps. You will find the briefcase, she said in the doorway, not turning. You will find a message you deserve and a message you do not. Forgive us both. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, when you stand by your river tomorrow, watch the eddies near the piles. For a moment only, if the barges have behaved badly upriver, you will see the water fold back on itself. That is what Louis meant. Not an omen, a habit. He loved habits. The door closed. The latch spoke softly. Maigret waited, listening to the house remember her footsteps. He took the envelope at last and put it, unopened, into the notebook as a man might press a leaf. When he stepped outside, the harbour had drawn its grey shawl tighter. The lamps along the quay wore halos the colour of old brass. He did not look for her among the alleys. He knew the uselessness of hunting a decision. He walked instead toward the water, the boards underfoot creaking each to its own opinion, and watched the tide toy with the mooring ropes. The sea is a clerk too, he thought, and the ledger it keeps is a horizon. Back in his room above the docks he lit his pipe and sat without removing his coat. He opened the notebook, then closed it again, then opened it a second time and took out the envelope. It was addressed in violet ink to a man whose name had been spelled by newspapers too often to look like his own. He turned it over once and slipped it back between the pages. Not tonight. There is a time for the weight of paper and a time for the weight of sleep. He left the candle burning and lay down. The harbour, unable to keep its counsel, muttered and sighed. In that soft, uncertain noise he heard their future receding, two silhouettes making the same choice at different speeds, two sets of footprints erased by the same indifferent damp. He thought of the phrase she had used, numbers becoming music, and of the way handwriting changes when a train leans into a curve. He was not a man to cry, and he did not, but a certain sting came into his eyes and vanished with the first draught from the unsealed window. In the morning he would look for the briefcase and he would find it. He would read the message that was for him and the one that wasn't. He would board a train and watch the wet fields run backwards while the world continued forward. And when he stood at last on his own bridge, the river would show him what it shows all men who stop pretending not to look, that truth has current and slack, that justice sometimes prefers low water, and that the heart, like a harbour, keeps the shape of ships long after they have gone. For now there was the candle, the notebook, and a house where the walls had learned to keep confidences. For now there was the sound of water pouring stone. For now there was the faint smell of lavender left behind for a man who would not chase it. He closed his eyes. The confession had changed everything and confirmed nothing. The rain had followed Maigret back to Paris, soft as a secret, falling through the street lamps like ash from a fire that refused to die. By the time he crossed Pont-Neuf, the river was swollen again, heavy and brown, carrying the reflection of the bridges as if they were ghosts of themselves. He stopped midway, pipe in hand, and let the damp air settle into his coat. The envelope was still in his pocket, untouched since that night by the harbour. It pressed faintly against his ribs when he breathed, like a heartbeat that did not belong to him. The city was almost empty at that hour. Only the slow rumble of a tram in the distance, the scuff of shoes on wet stone, and somewhere a cafe shutter slamming in the wind. He drew on his pipe and exhaled toward the river. The smoke drifted, wavered, and disappeared without ceremony. In its vanishing he saw the measure of the case, not tragedy, not crime, but a quiet erasure, the kind that leaves no headline, only a shift in the air. At the Quai des Orfèvres the lamps were still burning. The office felt smaller than when he had left it, as if the walls had drawn closer to watch him. He hung his coat on the peg, set his hat on the table, and opened the drawer where the black notebook waited. He placed the envelope beside it. For a long while he didn't move. The ticking of the clock filled the silence with patient insistence. Finally he broke the seal. Inside was a single page, written in the same careful violet ink. "Inspector, if you are reading this, it means the tide has done its work. Do not mourn the drowned. They have chosen their depth. What remains is the city, and men like you who keep it from forgetting that the living are also capable of disappearance." There was no signature, but her voice lingered between the lines, soft, precise, unafraid. He folded the page and placed it back inside the envelope. Then he opened the notebook for the last time. The ink had dried almost to dust. The writing looked brittle, as if it might crumble if touched too roughly. He thought of Louis Delcourt, the cautious clerk who had tried to tell the truth with numbers, and of the woman who had tried to save him with silence. Between them, they had written a confession without expecting absolution. He rose and went to the window. Outside, the Seine ran its slow procession beneath the arches, obedient to gravity, indifferent to memory. The phrase returned to him when the river runs backwards, and for the first time he understood. It was not a prophecy but a comfort, a way of saying that even if the world never turned in your favour, there would still be moments when it seemed to hesitate, when the current faltered just enough to make you believe it might. Lucas found him there an hour later. "You didn't go home?" he said. "I'm home enough," Maigret answered. They're closing the Le Havre file, officially an accident. Of course, Maigret said, tamping his pipe. They prefer accidents. They make better paperwork. Lucas hesitated. Do you want me to type the report? No, leave it. He looked at the notebook on the desk. There are things better left in their own handwriting. When Lucas left, Maigret sat again, the chair creaking softly beneath him. He reached for his glass and found it empty, though he could not remember drinking. He filled it from the bottle in the drawer and raised it slightly, not in a toast, but in acknowledgment, to the dead, to the living, to all those who had chosen their currents and disappeared into them. By dawn, the fog had thinned. He walked home through streets washed clean of footprints, the early trams sighing past like tired beasts. Madame Maigret was awake, a shawl around her shoulders, the smell of coffee rising from the kitchen. She looked up, eyes worried, but unsurprised. You didn't sleep, she said. Some nights are for staying awake, he replied, setting his hat down. She poured him coffee, the cup trembling slightly in her hand. Was it worth it? He smiled, faintly, the kind of smile that only reaches the eyes when there's nothing left to explain. It was necessary, he said. They sat in silence, listening to the city, stirring to life outside, the clip of hooves, the distant murmur of markets opening, the hiss of rain against the gutters. He thought of the sea, of the briefcase, of the woman who had chosen to vanish rather than let the truth be weighed and sold. And he thought of Louis, the clerk who had believed that ink could keep conscience afloat. After breakfast he walked again to the river. The sun was a pale disk behind the clouds, the water slick and quiet. Barges drifted slowly under the bridges, their wakes folding back on themselves in small, intricate patterns. For an instant he saw it, the water turning, pulling against itself, as if remembering another direction. Then it was gone. He leaned on the parapet and filled his pipe, striking a match against the stone. The flame flared, fought the wind, went out. He smiled at the futility and tried again. This time it caught, and the smoke rose straight upward, fragile but determined. Paris, he thought, was a city of survivals. Every morning it forgot 1,000 stories, and every night it dreamed new ones to replace them. The river carried them all, love, deceit, confession, silence, until they became indistinguishable, like rain in the sea. He took the notebook from his pocket one last time. The cover was worn smooth now, its edges softened by handling. He turned it over once, then let it slip from his hand. It fell without a sound, struck the surface, and vanished in a widening ring of ripples. The current caught it, turned it once, and drew it downstream. Maigret watched until the water smoothed again, until there was nothing left to see but the steady flow of the Seine under the pale morning light. Then he turned away, his steps slow but sure, the echo of his boots fading into the rhythm of the city that never truly slept. Behind him, the river went on, carrying its usual cargo of reflections, its quiet secrets, and somewhere beneath its brown surface, a small black notebook travelling without destination.